Hi, everybody. So welcome to tonight's discussion on climate change. We're going to be starting even shortly, just once it looks like everybody's arrived in the room. I can see the numbers are slowly going up. We're expecting something like 50 people to come along tonight's interesting session looking at climate change. We've got some fantastic speakers who are going to look at that issue from a number of different perspectives. So yeah, I can see that number's still going up, so I'll just leave it a few more seconds. Okay, looks like just about everybody who's going to join possibly has joined. So just to very quickly remind you that we'll have a recording of this webinar that will be uploaded onto the Scottish Wildlife Trust's YouTube channel, and we should have that uploaded early next week. So I'm now going to hand over to Julio, one of the Scottish Wildlife Trust young leaders, who's going to be chairing tonight's session. Julio.
Hello, can everyone hear me? Okay. And can you hear me? Can you give me a thumbs up? Yes, fine, excellent. Okay, I'm gonna start sharing my screen now. Right, so hello everyone and welcome. The name of this webinar is We Need to Talk About Climate Change. This event was organized by the young leaders of the Scottish Wildlife Trust. Today, we will be joined by three speakers: young climate activist Finley Pringle, doctoral researcher Joseph Gibbons, and the Trust's head of policy, Dagi Pido. My name is Giulio Biondi, and I will be your host for the day. Today, I'm accompanied by my fellow young leader, Kirsty Lees, who will be our question master, so to speak, picking up questions from the audience and reading them to the speakers after each presentation. If you wish to ask questions to any of our speakers, please send an email to the address shown on the slide. We will pick up your questions during the event and ask them to the speaker on your behalf. Please note that we might not have time to answer all the questions today, but we will try to pick the most popular ones. Moving on, it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker of the day. 13 years old Finlay from Allapool in the northwest Highlands of Scotland has always had a love for the marine environment, especially sharks. Since the age of 10, he has campaigned relentlessly to raise awareness about sharks and why they need to be protected, not feared. He has campaigned to stop restaurants serving shark fin soup and even took on Bear Grylls in 2018 over his shark dive experience at his new adventure park in Birmingham. In December 2018, he was the first school child in Scotland and possibly the UK to start climate striking, joining the Fridays for Future movement started by Greta Thunberg, as he saw the impact that climate change was having on the marine environment. In the last 3 years, Finlay has traveled to the Scottish and European parliaments to speak directly with politicians about climate change and given numerous talks, television, radio, and newspaper interviews about all of these issues. Among other things, Finlay is a marine conservationist, plastic pollution campaigner, and a global shark ambassador. Without further ado, please welcome Finley Pringle. Are you there, Finlay?
I am here.
Very well. Thank you for joining us today. When you're ready, please feel free to share your slides and start your presentation.
Hello, everybody. As Julia says, I'm Finley Pringle. I'm a 13-year-old climate activist from Allapool in the northwest Highlands of Scotland. It's lovely to be here tonight. So, we have for ourselves a climate crisis and an emergency. Climate change has already happened. The climate has already changed, and we're already feeling the impacts. So, Next week will be my 111th climate strike. So I started climate striking on the 14th of December 2018. Our oceans have played critical roles in climate change, from absorbing the carbon, which is now one of their main issues in creating ocean acidification, to slowing the heat. They also produce 50% of the oxygen we breathe and absorb 50% of the CO2 we produce, of which this is absorbed and created by plankton, by algae, and by kelp. There are signs that the oceans are becoming too warm. There's a massive reduction in area and depth of polar ice. 29% of the Great Barrier Reef was lost last year due to coral bleaching. Rising sea levels are impacting coastal populations, leaving climate refugees who have nowhere else to go. We're having more extreme weather events, floods, hurricanes, droughts, and fires. If we remember the wildfires in Australia, those were the worst they've seen there for a long time, and that's because of our human, what we've done. The top 1% the top 1% richest people of the population have produced double of the carbon of the poorest 50%. So there's all things that we can do to stop the climate crisis. So climate change for more plant-based diet. I think most of us know at this point that the production of meat is one of the largest benefactors to climate change. So it's producing it, and the animals which we grow to eat are being, they're producing methane, which is 20 times more effective than carbon. And not only this, we're cutting out large swathes of the Amazon rainforest to produce the soya that we then use to feed these animals. So there's issues with the climate gas emissions that it produces, and also with the habitat loss it produces. So reduce your energy usage. Another massive benefactor is that when we're producing energy, like electricity, this produces carbon dioxide. So because we burn oil, we burn coal, and these release it, but it also produces the energy. So insulating your house is as simple as that. It means you don't have to use gas to heat your home as much because it keeps the warmth in. And only use renewable energy, although that does have its own issues. 35% of all climate emissions come from energy production. Transport accounts for 24% of CO2 emissions. Whether you walk, cycle, use public transport, drive electric vehicles, and fly as low as possible. It's been calculated that a single hour in a plane produces 1/4 of a ton of CO2 for just an hour. So we need to consume less, we need to waste less. We need to refuse, reuse, repair, repurpose, and recycle as much of what we produce as possible. We need to talk about climate change to our friends and families, raise awareness, join a local climate strike. All of these things are very simple to do. I'm not going to force people to be vegan if they don't want to, but maybe just try meat less. It's also been figured out that a single day where you don't eat meat saves 6 kilograms of carbon. You should vote to influence politicians to adopt environmentally friendly policies. It's so simple. And at this point, we're needing government action, because all of these things that I've just mentioned are good. But what we need right now is our governments to act. We need to stop talking and take positive action. Be more ambitious with climate targets. We need to stop subsidizing fossil fuels and invest in renewable energy. We encourage a speedy transition to cleaner energy by introducing a carbon tax. We need to protect and restore ecosystems, which are key to fight against climate change. Declare climate emergency and make it meaningful, so that all future policies must take this into account. And make environmental education a priority in schools. What we need for our governments is to build back better. Boris may be saying that we're building back better, but we're building backwards. from making HS2 declaring bee-killing pesticides. And a final note, Joe Biden may have said, and we may believe he's doing that, but just yesterday he gave 30 new oil drilling licenses. So even though he says he's going to protect the climate, and he probably will better than Trump, he's already failing as well. So final words are that we need action now. There is no planet B.
Thank you so much, Finley. That was fantastic. What a great introduction to the event that you've just given there. Really, really good message for us all to take home and think about. So in terms of questions, let me just get these up just now. We've had a few in already from some of our own young leaders. Finley, someone's asking you here, at first, your career as an activist was fueled by your love for sharks. Was there a precise moment when you realised that climate change was another battle that you wanted to take on?
Well, what we need to realise is we keep separating everything. Oh, there's a climate emergency, there's a biodiversity emergency, and I suppose you could class as a COVID emergency. But in reality, these are all interconnected. We keep calling them three crises, but in reality, there's just one. Solving a biodiversity crisis will also help solve a climate crisis. And not going further into the jungle may not produce more viruses. Because the further we cut into the jungle, new vaccines that humans have never seen, viruses that humans have never seen before will come up. Because we're going into the habitat of animals that have evolved to deal with them and we haven't. So even though people call them the three crises, there's only one. We need to take it all on at the same time. So I think that answers the question.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much for sharing that, Finley. We had another question there on what are your personal goals for the future and where do you see yourself? If you decide someone said, if you decide to run the country, you have my vote.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, but I'd point blank rather actually do something useful. So, yeah, I don't know where I see myself at this point. I think I'll just continue what I'm doing. But as I say, I don't try and plan too far in the future. I'd rather live in the moment.
Thank you, Finley. That's fantastic. And do you have any projects that you're working on at the moment? Anything exciting lined up for 2021? We know that you've been striking against for the climate since 2018, you said, but what's on the horizon for you?
Well, after I took part in a conference, I was given some funding. So I'm going to use that with the shark conservation NGO Bite Back. So me and Bite Back, we're going to produce a educational pack for young kids in schools so they can learn about climate, ocean, sharks. So that's what probably going to be the most recent thing coming up. And yeah, I'll just keep school striking every week as well.
Fantastic work, Finley. That sounds really interesting on your project with Bite Back. You'll have to keep us all updated on how that gets on. I'm sure you'll do great. Also, just on a personal note, just wondering, we were talking about sharks before this event started. What's your favourite kind of shark?
You can't ask me that. It's like saying which is your favourite child. There isn't one. They're all so fascinating. Like, from the great white to the goblin to even the luminous shark, they're all so unique and so different, and yet they're all so fascinating in the same way. So yeah, that's a difficult question.
That's a perfect answer to a difficult question, Finley. We've had another question from a member of the audience asking if there's a network of activists similar to yourself. For example, is there an English equivalent to yourself or a German equivalent? That's from Peter. So thank you, Peter, for your question.
Thank you for the question. And I don't know. I feel like it's very difficult to have like an equivalent of everybody, but probably the best place to look is just look at Fridays for Future. Not everybody in Fridays for Future is passionate about sharks, but we all are passionate about climate change. So if you want to get involved, send them a message. They're sure to help you. They're sure to tell you where your nearest climate strike is and help you out.
Thank you, Finley. That was great. And I think that's us for the questions just now. So once again, I'll just say thank you on behalf of the Scottish Wildlife Trust and everyone watching today. It's been a fantastic and inspirational opening to this event. So thank you, Finley. We're very excited to see what you do next. I'll just pass on back to Julio now, who will introduce the next speaker.
Okay, thank you, Kirsty, and thanks again, Finley. That's a very powerful message that you convey, both about shark conservation and also, of course, about climate action. It is now time for our second speaker of the day. Joseph Gibbons is a doctoral researcher within the School of Engineering and Physical Sciences at Heriot-Watt University. His research centers on the performance improvement of clean, sustainable energy systems. He is passionate about tackling the anthropogenic climate change caused by combustion of billions of tons of fossil fuels. And he has presented at numerous conferences and has had the honor of being a guest lecturer. You can often find him trying to escape the lab to lecture postgraduate students on renewable energy related topics. Before his doctorate, he was a consultant engineer within the energy industry for nearly a decade and was involved in both large and community-driven low-carbon generation and sustainable energy developments. Joseph, thank you very much for joining us today. Please feel free to share your slides and start your presentation when you're ready.
Hi there, can everyone hear me okay? Can someone send a message just to say that they can see my slides and hear me? Or give me a thumbs up?
I certainly can. Hopefully
okay.
Our audience can.
Sorry, say that again, Julia? The audience can?
I think they can, yes. I think they can see you and your slides. Thank you, Joseph.
Great. Okay, so let me just set up here. So first of all, before I go into my talk, I just want to thank you, Julia, for the nice introduction, and hello to everybody who's joined us this evening. And before I talk about my topic, I just wanted to show you this visualization and just to try and allow you to let it sink in for a second to try and interpret what it probably represents. Now, this was created by climate scientist Ed Hawkins of University of Reading, and he wanted to design a way in which he could visualize climate change in an easier way for the general public to try and understand. Each stripe that you see represents the world's average temperature every year since the mid-19th century. And as you'd probably expect, dark blue years are cooler and dark red years are warmer than the long-term average temperature. And what's very obvious about this graphic, and why I personally like it, is that the cumulative change in temperature is very explicit and it's very obviously going in one direction. And what we can take from this graphic is that the world today is on average 1 degree Celsius hotter than the pre-industrial world. And that's such a significant change in temperature. Okay, so 2 seconds. So I'm going to talk about the past, present, and future of climate change. And as Julia would introduce, I'm a member of Heriot-Watt University, and I must acknowledge my funders, which is EPSRC. They fund my research and allow me to get involved in fantastic research and events like this. So without them, I wouldn't be here, I'm afraid. First of all, I'm just going to look at the past of climate change and how our society began to gain an understanding of what it is and how it occurs and what our involvement is. And first of all, it was French pioneer and mathematician Joseph Fourier, which was able to show that our atmosphere is keeping our terrestrial temperature warmer than it would be if we didn't have an atmosphere. So if we were to be exposed by the cold of outer space. And that sort of early understanding allowed us to realize that our atmosphere is acting like an insulator. And before his study, that wasn't particularly well understood. And that was such a shift in our understanding and appreciation of our planet. If we fast forward 40 years from that study, It was Irish physicist John Tyndall which was able to rate the properties of greenhouse gases, including carbon dioxide, methane, and water vapor. And he was able to show that they have certain absorption performance, which allowed the admittance of heat into our atmosphere and into our atmosphere and heat up our terrestrial surface, but it stopped outgoing heat and it sort of trapped all that heat. At the early 1900s, it was Swedish chemist Arrhenius which was theorizing that low carbon dioxide levels in our atmosphere historically were the cause of the ice ages that occurred. And that sort of theory allowed us to answer the question, or ask the question, what is the industrial use of coal doing in warming our planet? If low levels of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere were causing ice ages, what would that mean with the inverse if we had an increase in concentration? And that was such a big theory to question. All of these early pioneering studies allowed us to try and understand what that meant. And we now refer to that collectively as the greenhouse effect. And I presume that everyone in attendance has heard of this or is very aware of what this effect is. That was coined by Swedish chemist Elcombe, and it was a very nice way to describe the effect. What these early works did and could never have foreseen is the scale and growth of fossil fuel usage that was to follow in the next century, which is an enormous explosion of combustion. At the beginning of the century, the global combustion of fossil fuels, which is predominant, emitted 2 billion tons of CO2 equivalent. If we were to fast forward 50 years, it was 3 times that amount. And today, we're looking at about 20 times that amount of emission of greenhouse gases. The worrying statistic about all of these figures is that in the 270 years that have occurred since the Industrial Revolution, we have emitted 400 billion tons of CO2. And it's only been 30 years since we've emitted half of that. And that is such a worrying statistic to think about. And it's such an exponential growth. So the big question is, what happened? What caused this explosion of combustion of fossil fuels? Well, prior to the 1900s, no century had seen the human population to double. And in the 20th century, it doubled almost twice. This sort of corresponds to the Industrial Revolution and how our society transitioned away from one of an agricultural existence, which is defined by the harvests and the seasons. And it led us to a transformation of energy use, which allowed us to use mechanical power and later on electrical power. It wasn't until the mid-1900s that scientists started to really consider how to measure CO2 levels live, as opposed to historical levels that we see in carbon dating. And they wanted to understand our fossil fuel combustion and our emissions of greenhouse gases. How is that relationship understood? And they were really concerned about the fact that the oceans act as a carbon sink, but if we were to increase our emissions to such a level, would that change and would it even have a U-turn? And that is quite a worrying thing to think about. So in the mid-1950s, they set up an observatory in Hawaii, and that's the first recorded measurement of live greenhouse gas emissions in our atmosphere. And 10 years after that was established, the global average atmospheric CO2 concentration was 320 parts per million. Now, that was an increase of 40 parts per million prior to the Industrial Revolution. So that was unprecedented. That was an unprecedented growth of carbon emissions. What's really worrying is that it only took 30 years for another increase in 40 parts per million of CO2. And then only 20 years after that to see an additional 40 parts per million rise. As of 2019, the global average CO2 levels in our atmosphere is over 400 parts per million, and it's continuing to rise 2 parts per million annually. And again, that's a trend that we really need to change. So what is our effect as humans on this type of emission trend? What are our activities doing to cause this? Well, if you remember the hypotheses of Swedish chemist Arrhenius, And is our industrial use of coal causing the planet to warm? Well, that theory was later proven to be right. A huge study in the late 2000s was able to show that the temperature of our planet and the amount of CO2 in our atmosphere had an extremely strong correlation. And what they were able to show is that the primary cause of temperature difference between the glacial periods was due to the amount of CO2 in our atmosphere. The results show that CO2 levels are higher now than at any point in the last 800,000 years. And the last highest CO2 concentration was seen 3 million years ago. And the peaks that we see of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere correspond to warmer periods. And the inverse peaks, so the dips that we see, are the ice ages. And that's just unarguable. That is just proven fact now from the scientific community. And that leads us to today. You know, if we look at our early understandings and how that's led us to today, where do these sources of greenhouse gases come from? According to the US Energy Agency, about 68% of all greenhouse gas emissions are emitted as a result of energy generation and supply. Industrial processes, which is predominantly cement and steel production, are about 7%. Agricultural works are a further 11%. So it's quite clear what the huge slice of the pie is related to energy generation and our need to consume energy. So if we look at that and we see what is the share of energy and where is it coming from? If we look at 4 decades ago, we were supplying globally nearly 6,000 million tons of oil equivalent. And of that amount, 86% came from natural gas, coal, and oil. Now, worryingly, as of 2017, so only a few years ago, we had increased our energy supply by over 250%. But the thing that hasn't really changed is the share of fossil fuel generation. We've gone from gas, coal, and oil contributing 86%. It's now currently supplying about 80% of the share. So even though we've almost tripled our energy supply, the share of these fossil fuel energy sources hasn't particularly changed that much. So I just wanted to go through a very quick example of how much coal do we actually need to light an office space. Now, to simplify this, I wanted to look at a typical office space of 15 square meters, which was to be artificially lit for 12 hours in a day. And that, based on light bulb ratings, is about 1 kilowatt hour of energy. That's how much energy we need to light an office space. In 2019, the UK consumed about 8 million tons of coal, and about 7 million tons of that coal is imported, often from Russia or Colombia. So I'm going to look at a conversion process of this fuel into electricity for our needs and how it's used in a coal-fired power plant. I'm going to use the Drax power station in North Yorkshire as an example. It's quite a big power station. And where we're going to look at where the coal comes from, the largest open pit coal mine in the world is based in Colombia, and it's absolutely massive. Well, here's a picture of it here, and I don't think that this image really reflects how big this coal mine really is. It's about 180 to 170,000 acres. And to put that into context, that's over 2.5 times the size of Edinburgh. That's how massive this coal pit is. So if we look at coal from that goes to Drax power station to light our office for 12 hours in a day, we're going to start from the extraction process. And we're going to go through step by step how we can convert that to electricity. So in the extraction, we need about 295 grams of coal. And in that extraction process, we lose about 15 grams. So that's just lost off the bat straight away. Then it's transported to ships, which needs to be transported across the Atlantic to the UK. And in that process, we lose about 2 grams, just because of the efficiency of the ships, etc. So of the 270 grams of coal that reaches the UK shore and then is transported to Drax power station, it needs to be converted to heat and then electricity. And this is the biggest loss along all of these processes. We lose about 30% of our coal in this way, and it's just waste heat that's ejected from the power plant. With the remaining 97 grams of coal, which is now electricity, but I'm comparing the two, we need to transmit it and finally distribute it along the grid to the end user. And that's about 10% or 90% efficient. So we lose about 10%. So 9 grams of coal is lost. And that leaves us with 88 grams of coal equivalent that finally reaches our structure to light our office for 12 hours. But based on the current efficiency rating of light bulbs, about 68 grams of that is lost through heat. And that gives us 26 grams of coal left to light our office space. So that's a very simplified conversion process of coal from the pit to an office space. Overall, this process from extraction to the office space for our lighting is about 8.5 or 8.8% efficient. And if anyone in this event has gone through or walked along any night, town, we know that lights are left on. And about 40% of lighting that occurs in non-buildings occurs for unoccupied. So worryingly, these lights are left on and aren't particularly being used at all. And I would ask the question, how efficient is that? Is it 0%? And this is a sort of unquantifiable efficiency. So I think that the scientific community as a whole obviously realize that a major change is necessary. The IPCC believe we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions from 60 to 8% compared to the 1990 level, and eventually achieve a net zero carbon energy source. And these are critical measures to ensure that we maintain our temperature, but also to minimize the damage that climate change is causing to our planet. Increasingly worrying, though, is that since that pact was made in Paris, in the Paris Agreement in 2015, we've emitted a further 765 billion tons of carbon dioxide. And the decade from 2010 to 2020 was on average 0.5 degrees Celsius hotter than the 1980s. And in some regions in the world, like northern latitudes, they're seeing an even greater increase in temperature. And places like the Arctic are seeing an increase of 3 degrees Celsius on average. And these are enormous figures to see. And the importance of the limitation of 1.5 degrees is something that is bandied about and is a target that governments and politicians have agreed to try and uphold, but it doesn't mark the threshold beyond which the world becomes uninhabitable. It doesn't mark a tipping point of no return. It doesn't particularly lay out a pathway in which we need to ensure that this is achieved. So these are very concerning things to think about. And that leads us to the third segment of this talk, which is the future of climate change. Before I talk about that, I just want to put into context the impact of climate change and what it does or doesn't mean. We know that this is bandied about in the media, what it's talked about by politicians, etc. And I think overall, scientists, including myself, are very frustrated by what it does or doesn't mean. So what it doesn't mean is that the end of the world. The world has been here for a very long time, and it will continue to be here for a very long time. What's in danger is the living things on the planet. And that's one thing that I always have to try and establish. It doesn't mean that we're on the edge of extinction as humans, although we have obviously endangered animal species. But as a human species, we're not just going to die out very quickly. And it doesn't mean the planet's in peril. It's not as if all of these climate change occurrences that we have contributed to can be reversed. I think they can be reversed. The attitude of giving up and accepting our fate as having been irreversible consequences means that we could continue to burn fossil fuels. And I don't think that's the right attitude to take. I think that there is mechanisms in place that we could try to ensure that we can reverse the damage that we've caused. What I think it does mean, and this is quite a grim reality, is that climate change has been and will continue to be a massive threat to countless living things. It's going to cause displacement of tens of millions of living things, including humans, of course. And that's a very conservative view. It's going to disrupt our farming industry, which has huge consequences both to our ability to eat and also the economy, which is largely based on a lot of farming practices. And even more importantly, arguably, is our supply of water. If we run out of potable water, where does that leave us as a species? Sadly, because of thermodynamic inertia, further warming is absolutely certain. If we were to stop all fossil fuel combustion today, our planet would continue to increase in global average temperatures for many years to come. The analogy that I think best describes this is a pan of water that you would boil. If you were to take off the energy, it will continue to heat up momentarily before it starts to reduce, and that's due to inertia. And what matters more is the total amount of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere, not necessarily the rate in which it increases. So we really just need to think about collectively reducing the concentration of greenhouse gases that we have in our atmosphere. The further damage this is going to cause is well documented and probably very obvious to a lot of people here in attendance, but it is going to cause more extreme and frequent and intense natural disasters due to weather. It's going to change the patterns of rainfall and drought that we're going to experience. It's going to have huge disruptions and consequences to ecosystems. It's going to increase sea levels once the alpine ice caps melt. And these are collectively massively important things to try to combat, as we all know. So what is needed? You know, what the big question is, how is this going to be resolved? And, you know, I'm not going to sit here to have the answer to that. Because I don't, but I think the general feeling from the scientific community is what we do next is extremely important, and how we can minimize the damage caused depends on several factors. How we respond in the next few decades as a species is so vital. Our understanding and our awareness, and you know, Finley here is a fantastic example of a younger generation really becoming aware of the importance of this and trying to drive the message across so we can react. Politicians need to make sure that they prioritize the climate issues, and we really need to transform the world economy. Now, I'm not suggesting that capitalism needs to be overthrown, but I think that this continued growth and consumption of energy is leading to a huge problem that we're experiencing. And I guess overall, and again, this is a little bit biased from myself perhaps, but this really needs to achieve a clean and sustainable supply of energy so that it's decarbonized and we can rely on it for our needs, but also that it doesn't continue to emit huge levels of greenhouse gas to our atmosphere. So before I go, I just want to talk about this person here. This is Michelle Bachelet, and she is the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. And in her opening statement at the Council in 2019, she sort of asked the senators that were in attendance what interests are being advanced by the policies that the damage of climate change is being caused by all of humans, and how is these policies being prioritized over our well-being and our environment. And this is obviously true to climate change problems as well. And she sort of left that message across of, try counting your money while you hold your breath. And I think that is such an important message to try and understand. So thank you for listening. I'm happy to try and answer any questions that I have, but I really appreciate you all listening.
Thank you, Joe, very much for your presentation. That was really interesting to watch. Now, I do believe that Kirsty has some questions ready for you.
Okay.
And I will share my screen again so that people can see the email address to which they should be sending their questions.
Before I get asked questions, can I just check if the slides were uninterrupted? Because I had some internet problems during that talk. Were they quite?
We had a bit of a breakup in your audio, but everything was perfectly understandable. and the slides didn't have any hiccups as far as I could tell.
Okay, that's great.
Perfect. Thank you, Joe. Echoing Julio's words, that was a great presentation, really, really fascinating, and so interesting to hear from an expert on the energy side of things as well. We've had a couple of questions come in. So Janet, asking from the Western Isles, she says that we should be self-sufficient in energy, but we have been forced into burning fossil fuels as big business has not invested in a basket of energy sources, but instead installed a subsea cable that recently broke and won't be repaired in the near future, if ever. I believe that every roof should have PV cells and air source heat pumps. There should be turbines under every causeway and unnavigable rocky area, and energy storage like at, forgive my pronunciation on this, Festiniog, in brackets, that I saw on a school trip in 1969. What can I do as a mere mortal to get us to use energy in a responsible way?
Well, that's a really good question, and I agree with the observations made as well. First of all, I think a lot of people, when they think how they themselves as an individual can become more sustainable and more environmentally conscious with their energy needs, they immediately think of these flashy technologies like wind turbines and solar panels. And look, I'm an advocate of these things, of course, but I think we can also look at a slightly less attractive and simpler, boring thing as well. A lot of our energy demands, we looked at about 68% of all greenhouse gas emissions come from energy needs. Of energy, a lot of that is to do with the space heating that we require. And things like insulation and triple glazing windows are not cheap, but they're cheaper than quite expensive technologies. And they're the first things I would say people should look at. I don't necessarily agree that all buildings should have solar panels or that we should have wind turbines everywhere possible, because I think that we need to be considerate of the environment too. But of course, if it's viable financially and of course environmentally friendly to have it where you are, perhaps that's something we can look at. And I think that sort of needs to be supported and subsidized by political decisions, because it really comes down to the political motivation and how they can help members of the public try to become more sustainable and conscious of how much energy they use. And of course, there are much more complex things that need to occur, like the grid system needs to become more complicated and more efficient. It's a huge question, but I think try to think simple first before moving on to something more expensive. And hopefully the alignment of politicians' decisions can help that too in the future. So I hope that answers it as well as it could.
Thank you, Joe. That was a really informative answer. And thank you, Janet, for asking that question. We have another question. P is asking, if we stopped all greenhouse gas emissions, what temperature would the globe rise to?
Well, I don't know the answer to that off the back of my head. That requires huge amounts of study from lots of research. But we do feel as though if greenhouse gas emissions stop now, it would take 5 to 12 years to see the effects of our current levels of greenhouse gas emissions. So the temperatures that we're experiencing now are a result of our activities in 2005 to 2008. So that's kind of the inertia delay. What that means in terms of temperature is extremely complicated, and I don't know the answer, if I'm honest. But if you do want to check, not necessarily scientific studies, but if you wanted to check guidance on the matter, the IPCC produce a report every number of years. I think it's every 5 years. And in that, they can estimate what temperatures we can expect to see in various scenarios. And I do believe that includes a scenario if there was zero greenhouse gas emissions now. There is one thing to also add to this, and this is quite a controversial thing to say, but the amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere and other greenhouse gases are also causing what's called a carbon shadow, in that they are also filtering out and sort of hiding the actual temperature that we had. So I'm trying to think of a good example which demonstrates that. So after 9/11, after the event in 9/11, 2001, with the World Trade Center, the following day, there were 0 flights globally, which we can all understand why that occurred. And what we saw was an increase in global temperature. And that was because all of the pollution from aviation was actually causing a blanket which was blocking out certain elements of sunlight. So as hot as we are now and how worrying it is to climate change, the carbon emissions are also disguising how hot we should actually be. So, it's such a complicated answer, but I guess it's not as straightforward as you perhaps think.
That's fascinating. I didn't know that at all. Thank you, Joe, for speaking about that. It's really interesting about the carbon shadow. We have another question as well from one of our young leaders who's saying that climate change is a complex issue that's being discussed every day in many different rooms. Is there a single solution among the ones being proposed by governments, private businesses and universities that you feel is more likely to succeed?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I don't know personally what's being talked about politically behind closed doors and policy making, but from an engineering perspective, and certainly well acknowledged by the scientific community involved in energy, it's quite clear that we need a combination of sustainable, low carbon technologies to supply our energy, combined with the storage of those energy supplies. Now, the media quite often accuse renewable energy as being intermittent forms of energy. And to an extent, they're right. The difference is it's variably intermittent in that we rely on the natural resources to be available when we want lights to be on or when we want our heating to be on. And it's not necessarily correlated. So having the ability to try and generate when we need energy is combated by a huge number of wind turbines, let's say onshore wind turbines in the UK. And that sort of allows statistically the availability of energy. But I would like to see, and I think it's, again, acknowledged and accepted, that we really need to combine renewable energy technologies with storage, whether that be rapid response storage or seasonal storage, etc., so that we can store our energy when it's available, and when we don't need it, we can store it to a time when we do actually need it. And I think that's the key to success. Renewable energy will struggle to succeed without the ability to store it when it's required. And I'm not going to get into the question of nuclear energy. Whether you're for or against is another debate for another day, which I don't want to go into. But I can see that politicians are putting their eggs in one basket there, in relying on the option of having nuclear energy available and online when they phase out coal stations, which they've committed to do, certainly in Europe and also in other parts of the world. So whether that's the right thing to do or not, I'm not going to go into, but for sure, I would like to see renewable energy succeed, and that needs storage to be available too. So that's where it needs to happen.
Thank you, Joe. Another really informative answer there. And I think we've got time for one more question. So does the individual have much power when it comes to combating climate change, or is it mainly the power of governments?
Yes, the individual does, in that an individual vote for politicians may not mean anything on its own, but collectively it does. And I think it's the same with climate change and awareness of that. And politicians align themselves to what the general public's opinion will be, and that was swayed by what we believe to be the right thing. And if more people in the public were really more passionate, I'm not saying they're not, but if they really drove home the priority of trying to combat climate change, politicians would be inevitably forced to align themselves to that. We're seeing that already. Not enough, I would argue, but we are seeing that shift or that transition towards that politicians are taking it seriously. So yes, I would believe that everyone's opinion and voice is important. If we don't do anything, how would anything change? We can't rely on other people. We need to do it ourselves. And it's a complicated answer, but I think every person has a duty to make sure that we try to make sure that this is tackled.
Thank you, Joe. That's great. And thank you once again on behalf of everyone here today for your incredible talk. Very, very interesting. The energy side of things is one that's not often talked about, certainly not in the conservation sector. So thank you so much for giving your expert opinion on that. I'll now hand over to Julio, who will introduce our next speaker.
Yes, thank you, Kirsty, and thanks again, Joe, for joining us today and for answering our questions. It is now time for our last speaker of the day, Dagi Pido. He's the head of policy at the Scottish Wildlife Trust and was previously the chief economic advisor to the government of Jersey for 14 years. And prior to that, he worked in London for 10 years in several economist roles. And so, Dagi, whenever you're ready, feel free to share your slides and start your presentation. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Just bear with me a second while I get this up and running. Does that look good to everybody? Great, that's one relief. Okay, nice to talk to you all this evening. I'll try and be as quick as I can, as I'm sure people have got thoughts on what else they can be doing on Friday evening. But I hope this presentation builds on what's been two excellent presentations and some of the themes that have emerged from that. And let's just hope I can hold up the rear end and keep the quality to the same level. What I want to do is really talk about nature's role in addressing the climate emergency, something that we've touched on already, and maybe partly answering Joseph's question about what can we do about the trends that we're facing. I'll split it into kind of four sections. I'll give you a little bit of the political context in Scotland at the moment around nature-based solutions, the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis. Take a little bit of time to explain why they are important, why they've got a key role to play. Talk a little bit in general terms about what nature-based solutions are, but also quite importantly, thinking about what they mean in a Scottish context. And then as head of policy, I feel I should maybe conclude with a little bit of advocacy about what we need to do in Scotland and what the approach should be to get nature-based solutions front and central. Starting off with the political context, there has been some promising developments in terms of comments coming out from Scottish Government since they declared the climate emergency in 2019. Clear recognition from the highest level from the First Minister in terms of the desire to tackle both the biodiversity and climate crisis together, and that they want Scotland to be leading the way. So certainly in terms of the rhetoric, very positive. That was back in 2019, most recently going back just before Christmas in Scottish Government's update to the climate change plan. Again, very strong words around the need to secure a green recovery from the crisis we face, that's got to cut across all the key areas of economic, social and environmental well-being, and quite importantly, tackling those twin challenges of climate emergency and biodiversity loss together. And even if you look at the Scottish budget that was published just yesterday, again, we see some fairly strong statements, encouraging statements about the need to tackle the climate and nature crisis together, and even using the words nature-based solutions and the need to get them ingrained. So at the highest level, encouraging political context. If we just move on and think a little bit more about why are they actually important? Well, you don't need me to tell you. International experts have shown that nature-based solutions can provide, up to about a third of the climate mitigation needed to keep global warming below 2 degrees C. And it's not just a nice to have, it's not just an add-on, it's actually, we need the nature-based solutions alongside all the changes in behavior, some of which Joseph touched on in his presentation. So it's not the case that, we can trade off, reducing our fuel consumption. We need to reduce our fuel consumption, and we need the nature-based solutions if we're really going to tackle climate change. Finley nicely talked about building back better, and I think he was emphasizing sometimes how those words can be a little bit hollow. In terms of thinking about a green recovery and how we start to build back from the significant economic and social challenges that we face at the moment. Actually, investment in nature-based solutions, green and blue infrastructure can have a key role to play in that. And again, it's not just me saying that. You might question whether 233 leading economists could be wrong, but research published just last year asked them what some of the key interventions could be to address both the need to get the economy going again and to address the climate crisis. And lo and behold, natural infrastructure investment was seen as one of the most strongest things that you could do at this point in time. The other thing to think about in terms of why they're important is just that if you invest in traditional solutions, think about flood defences, concrete barriers, the like, you invest in that, yes, and you potentially prevent flooding in many years' time if that event occurs. If you invest the same amount of money in nature-based solutions and they deliver the same outcome, prevent the flooding, while those nature-based solutions are there, you get added benefits every year, year in and year out. So there's some real, real incentive to actually use nature-based solutions because of the spin-off benefits that you get from that investment. The other thing to focus on, yes, it's necessary to address the climate crisis, but it's also really important just to reflect on where we are in terms of nature and the state of biodiversity in Scotland. Just a couple of bits of data here, looking at the abundance of biodiversity in Scotland. This is looking across mammals, it's looking across insects and birds as well, and clear evidence that over this time period since 1994, about a 25% decline overall in the abundance of biodiversity in Scotland. Also on the bars on the right hand side there, both in the short term and the long term, about 50% of species are seeing a moderate or strong decrease over that period of time. So the challenges alone in terms of addressing these biodiversity trends are massive, but if you combine that with the need to address the climate crisis as well, you can see that it's fundamental that we get a grip on nature-based solutions and really start to change the trends that we're seeing. Just a little bit in terms of what nature-based solutions are. I'm sure most of you are aware, but I think it's always just important to reflect, again, drawing on the experts in terms of what are nature-based solutions. Well, it's restoring ecosystems in a way that will help address the social challenges that we face, and at the same time providing the benefits to humans and biodiversity. So it's a triple win, if you like, in terms of the investment. It can help address all these issues at the same time, and given the situation that we face and some of the trends at this point in time, it just seems, how can we not take up the opportunity with nature-based solutions? If you think about them in a Scottish context, this isn't exhaustive by any stretch of imagination, but we kind of look at nature-based solutions in 5 categories, going literally from land to sea, from cities to the rural side of things. And I'll probably just spend a little bit of time now just discussing some of these areas, and maybe start in a more positive area, and then areas where we probably need to improve, to put things politely. Okay, if we just think about peatland, it's a bit of an unsung hero in terms of what it does for us. It's only 3% of the land area across the globe, but in fact it absorbs something like 2 times the amount of carbon that our forests absorb. So it's actually, in terms of helping to address climate change, it really is quite an unsung hero, and not something that many people don't really appreciate. In terms of the situation in Scotland, we have 60% of UK's peatlands in Scotland. So we have a significant proportion of peatlands, but unfortunately that 60% of UK peatlands is in pretty poor condition. We've got about 70% of peatlands in Scotland are in a damaged state. And the problem then is that peatlands, rather than storing carbon, start emitting carbon. So we've got a situation where we have a potential really valuable carbon store. It's in a damaged state, and it's emitting something like 15% of our emissions at this point in time. So it seems like a no-brainer that correcting this situation would help address the trends that we've seen Joseph outline. And it's encouraging. I'm starting from a more encouraging position in terms of where we are in Scotland. Scottish Government have already committed £250 million over the next 10 years to invest in the restoration of peatlands across Scotland. So they've the pennies dropped with them around peatland, which is really positive. They're actually backing it with meaningful investment. It doesn't mean that the situation is one to take your eye off the ball. Not only do we need to restore the peatland, we need to think how we maintain it, but we also need to think about we can restore it in one place, and at the moment we are extracting it commercially in other places, and we're using it horticulturally in the plants that we use in our gardens. So a lot of positive news in terms of what Scottish Government are doing in this area, and I think I'm starting from a positive position and maybe moving on to areas where there's less positive news and really more room for improvement. Just thinking about woodland, I think most people understand the role that woodland and forestry can play in helping to address climate change. In Scotland, we've got about 19% coverage of forest. 19% of the land is woodland or forestry, which seems quite high, but in fact it's actually quite low. It's below the EU average. And although we all seem to identify Scotland with forests and uplands, the picture on the top left there is probably one that's far more common than on the bottom right. In fact, it is more common. That is, the vast majority of our forests are Sitka spruce, which is a non-native species. It's quite often planted in a very dense way, which means its biodiversity benefits are very limited. And on the bottom right-hand side, we have native woodland, which can really bring similar carbon benefits to commercial forestry, but also has biodiversity benefits as well. And what we're seeing at the moment is Scottish Government, again, making some encouraging noises and actually some encouraging commitments in terms of overall coverage of forestry and a map we're going to achieve each year going forward. The targets are increasing, but at the moment, the rhetoric is really around just general forestry. It's less about native woodland and the important role that that can play in delivering the nature-based solutions. And I think that's something that certainly is the trust we're trying to emphasise. Even yesterday in the Scottish budget, we were told yet again about the wonderful new targets for Scottish forestry, but very little. We couldn't find anything in the Scottish budget about native woodland and the importance of native woodland. If we move to the urban environment, there's lots that can be done across the globe, and is in fact being done across the globe, and particularly in Scotland, to help use nature to address the climate challenge that we're facing. On the top left there, a nice picture of green roof on a primary school in Scotland. Green roofs can have a number of advantages in helping address the climate challenge, both in terms of reducing heat, reducing pollution, reducing runoffs from roofs. Some real benefits from green roofing, something that could happen a lot more. The picture there is really the exception rather than the rule. And there's a question mark in terms of, how much is really being incentivized, or how much is this really being incentivized in Scotland? Do our planning processes really take into account the need and the advantages we can get in our urban environment? I think the simple answer is no. And we need to look at how our planning systems encourage and incentivize the urban environment and urban greenery. The other aspect is really around green spaces. I think it's one thing that's come out of the crisis, the coronavirus crisis that we're facing at the moment, is that people have connected much more with their public spaces. If you look at Google data, people have been spending more time in their parks when it's been within the rules, obviously. And there's a real opportunity here to look at how we use our green space, how we actually connect it up, and how we can bring biodiversity benefits and the climate benefits that we know green space can provide. Turning now to the marine environment, Finley has got far more expertise than me on the marine environment and has already set out the situation really well. Often when we think of our seas, we think about the food that we potentially get, we think about the enjoyment through recreation, all the things that we're kind of familiar with, the jobs that it potentially provides. But actually, it's a really has an important role in our environment as well. If you look over the last 10 years, our seas alone have been able to absorb something like a quarter of human emissions over that last 10-year period. And why is that? Well, actually, when you get below the surface, pun intended there, there's a whole host of things going on which people don't really fully understand. And I think the real opportunity for Scotland, given the length of our coast, given how much sea there is in Scotland, a real chance for us to look and think, okay, how can we really maximise the benefits? A couple of pictures here in terms of how carbon can be absorbed. Kelp forests on the top left, seagrass on the right, similar things to what we see on land, but under the surface and sometimes out of sight. Also, in terms of the actual seabed itself, I think the seabed, the top 10 centimetres of seabed is estimated to store something like the same amount of carbon as all of the peatlands in Scotland as well. So really important role for our marine environment. And what can we do about this? Well, actually, it's slightly different to the approach on land. Some of it is actually just allow the marine environment to recover, remove some of the pressures. Obviously, addressing climate change in itself will help, but remove the pressures that are on the marine environment, allow it to do its thing and actually recover and really make a bigger contribution at this point in time. Last, but by no means least, agriculture. Really important in terms of land use in Scotland. Something like 80% of our land is used for agriculture in Scotland. But the flip side of that is that it's also one of the biggest emitters of greenhouse gases. If you look at the chart there that I put together, this is relatively up-to-date information from the Climate Change Plan update, which I mentioned was out at the end of last year. Just looking at the emissions in the dark blue bars, and then what Scottish Government is, through its Climate Change Plan, is hoping to achieve over the period up to 2032. The first thing is obviously just how large the emissions are in 2020 from just one sector, agriculture, which is a very small proportion of our economy, nearly half of the emissions from all of industry. The second thing, which I think kind of highlights the situation, is that the current plans are that actually agriculture will reduce its emissions by the least amount, least proportion over that 12-year period. Now, I think that's actually, reflecting government's approach at the moment, which seems to much more focus on agriculture, the importance, obviously, that it provides in the rural economy in terms of jobs and economic activity. But the focus is really on about maintaining the status quo. And that, to some degree, is understandable given the uncertainty around Brexit. But if you look south of the border and what's happening there, there seems to already be a much more progressive discussion and debate around how agriculture can help contribute to climate change. Well, it is contributing to climate change, but helps reduce climate change and also address the biodiversity crisis. So you've probably heard of the discussion around public money for public goods, hundreds of millions of pounds going to farmers in Scotland at this point in time. Can we not make that money better targeted to help them do the things which a lot of them are doing at this point in time, but we need to see being done in a more widespread fashion and taken up more wholeheartedly across the sector? If we can actually give them money to incentivize that rather than to incentivize the status quo, then I think we could start to see that those bars really reduce and a bigger contribution from agriculture. So that's kind of a whistle-stop tour of the issues around nature-based solutions in Scotland. I said I wanted to do a little bit of advocacy at the end. This is just a chart that we put together to send to politicians and to some of the political parties in terms of what the right approach is for Scotland at the moment. It's what we want to see. We want to see this approach kind of embedded in the party manifestos for the Scottish election that's coming up this year. And ultimately, we want to see this generate greater change and much speedier change in Scotland. So in terms of what we're talking about, just in very simple terms, to really embed nature-based solutions in Scotland, we think there's much that can be done in terms of just addressing nature recovery right now. We've got an 11-point action plan, nature recovery plan, which we published last year, which sets out, really specific actions that can be done now to help restore nature. But that needs to be complemented as well with a top-down approach in terms of investment in natural infrastructure. We need to see the connectivity of that natural infrastructure really highlighted and focus on a new network in Scotland of natural infrastructure. We refer to it as the Scottish Nature Network, but it's really about connecting habitats in Scotland and getting the biodiversity and climate benefits from that. Also, in terms of money, there is obviously a potential bill involved here. I mentioned how some of it can be achieved by reallocating existing funding, but I think we do need to look at new ways of getting money into conservation. The Trust itself, in partnership with SEPA, did a great initiative last year on a £1 billion challenge, looking at how we could raise £1 billion new money for conservation finance, and that's not directly from a taxpayer. Clearly, the Scottish Government has got a key role to do with public funded money. So I think it's got to be that kind of three-pronged approach that we see in Scotland, tackling the nature recovery itself and directly investing in our natural infrastructure and drawing on new sources of finance to make this happen. So I'll stop there. Hopefully that's given a reasonable coverage of the issues, and happy to take questions.
Thank you, Dougie. That was fantastic, and obviously, really, it's really nice to see how much the Trust cares and how much the Trust is involved with the tackling of climate change, not only directly but also trying to exert the necessary pressure on policymakers. So I do believe that Kirsty has some questions ready for you.
Yeah, we've had a few questions in. I echo what Julie was saying. Dougie is really interested, and it's really great to see the Trust so concerned with climate change, like everyone should be. So without further ado, I'll start off with a question we had from Janet. And Janet says that I agree with Schumacher, not Michael, but Ernest, a Nobel Prize winning economist who wrote Small is Beautiful, which was a study of how economics centered around people. How can we get this approach widely accepted, especially big business and politicians who seem only to be able to see things in terms of bigger and more profitable short-term options and not long-term advantages?
Yeah, really good question. I think, one of the ways to get the message across is a kind of bottom-up and top-down approach. Politicians need to hear directly from the electorate how important these issues are. We know, and we've seen both kind of independent economic advisors to Scottish Government and Scottish Government itself saying that their focus is now around well-being, about improving well-being, moving on from some of the more traditional approaches to economics and just focusing on things like GDP. But I think we've got to push them harder and say, okay, what does that actually mean? And when you're putting together things like your economic strategy, which we'll expect a new one after the election, and hopefully an action plan alongside that, how is it really going to make a difference on things like well-being? And I think the critical question is, how can you improve well-being if you're not improving your natural environment at the same time? It just goes without saying that if you don't achieve that, then you will ultimately fail in improving well-being. So I think you've got to give government some recognition. They are involved in an alliance with other countries trying to address the well-being issue. So they are making progress. And in fact, there was an opinion column in the Sunday Times down in England from some leading thinkers actually highlighting the progress that was being made in Scotland. So I think we've got to recognise the progress we're making, but push Scottish Government to be harder, and that's got to move quicker, and that's got to come from the grassroots up, but also organisations like ourselves and others to actually say, okay, you're talking about well-being. This is what well-being actually means for Scotland, and this is how we address the social, environment and economic challenges together.
Thank you, Dougie. On the topic of that, you know, Scotland prided itself on being the first country in the world to declare a state of climate emergency. What evidence have we seen so far of that being a fact?
The fact that it's declared the climate emergency, and I think to be fair, they've you know, updated their climate change plan to reflect that new imperative. I think, if we're honest, we were a little bit underwhelmed with the climate change plan. There were some positive developments towards the end of last year. We felt we were on a little bit of a run with grouse moor licensing, what was said around the kind of Scottish biodiversity strategy, which we were expecting to be developed this year. But then when we got to the climate change plan update, we were told yet again that the solution and nature-based solutions were what was already announced on peatlands, which I've touched on today. Is a positive development, but there's only so many times you can take the same announcement. And also, you know, going back to that point that I made right at the start, the important role that nature-based solutions can play in addressing climate change. They're not an add-on and a nice to have, they're absolutely essential to it. And I think that's a little bit that's lacking at the moment. So yes, they've declared the emergency, they've ramped up their plans, but there is a gaping hole at the moment in terms of nature-based solutions, and you know, do their plans really add up? Can you afford to allow agriculture just to reduce its emissions by 24% if what you're saying is you want to reduce overall emissions by 75% over that same time period? So there are some weaknesses in some areas where I think there's room for big improvements, but at the same time, some progress has been made at the highest level.
Thank you, Dougie. We've had quite a few questions from our young leaders as well, so I'll just start asking some of them. Protecting habitats and land has always been difficult, as even with SSSI status, it seems these sites can still be under threat by people planning to build houses or even golf courses, despite the policies set in place. In this case, should there be more of an extreme focus, more of an extreme form of protection and legislation for any progress to be made for nature's sake?
I think it's a kind of yes and no answer to that one. Absolutely, if we can protect more land, then you know, that's got to be a positive, but it's got to have the right protection. So there's a big campaign around, you know, now about, and I think Scottish Government has now signed up to it, to make sure we protect 30% of our land. But our question is, what are the protections within that land? So within that 30%, that includes things like national parks, where the protections are very limited. If you get down to the SSI level, then of course the protections are much greater. And I'd like to think that those protections can stand up to the challenges that they face. We've mentioned golf courses. We had a very good outcome in terms of our campaign to stop the golf course at Cool Links, but it should never have got that far. How you can be contemplating building on a site that is, you know, a golf course on a site that's internationally important, has several layers of protection, not just SSI status, seems ridiculous. So it is a little bit worrying that you can get that close. And in fact, in recent weeks, we've seen things about, you know, potentially doing other developments on that very same site. So I think protection's definitely got a role, but at the same time, you can't protect all of Scotland. And I think, you know, if you look at the figure that I mentioned, 80% of our land is agricultural land at the moment. Protecting, you know, some sites has a role to play, but you need that change as well within land management and how we use our land. It's fundamental that you have both.
Thank you, Dougie. That's great. We had a question from N in the audience as well, who asked, should we mention the benefits that climate change may bring? And I suppose just on a personal note for me, to add to that, are there benefits that climate change might bring to Scotland's biodiversity, if not Scotland's people?
You can maybe use one or two examples for, you know, individual species, but at the international level, the Scottish level, whether it's on land or sea, you know, climate change is one of the biggest drivers of biodiversity loss. So I think you've got to look at the macro picture and say, you know, overall, this is one of the key drivers of biodiversity loss across the world, and it needs to be addressed, and not just look at individual situations and what might be happening with individual species.
Perfect, thank you, Dougie. And we've just got time for one more question there. So the conservation sector is facing many challenges at the moment: the biodiversity crisis, climate change, and over the past year, COVID-19. From your point of view, what is the most pressing among these issues?
I think it's probably the combined effect. You know, we had a climate and biodiversity crisis before the kind of economic health crisis, you know, from COVID, but they are combining. You know, you could probably look back on, you know, how the economy was performing and say there was severe concerns about how we went about our economic strategic approach, and that needs to change. I think, you know, with the onset of COVID and the difficulties that's created, that there's clearly you know, a combined challenge now. But ultimately, this is where kind of nature-based solutions are really fundamental to this, as I think I've tried to get across, that it can help with all these challenges. It's not that, you know, it's nature-based solutions to climate change, but it's nature-based solutions to health and well-being. It's nature-based solutions to you know, reducing flood risk. There's a whole host of benefits that we get from nature-based solutions. So I think it's actually the biggest challenge for us is getting people to understand and being able to demonstrate the benefits relative to other investments. So one of the things we worked on was around kind of natural infrastructure investment in Scotland, and we have billions of pounds put into our infrastructure investment plan, and it was only to some extent through our lobbying and other people's lobbying that the Scottish Infrastructure Commission advised Scottish Government to include natural infrastructure within that definition. So the fact that they've got it included now is brilliant, but it's quite tricky to compare the benefits of investment in digital technology, say with investment in urban greenery, and to get a unit of measurement where you can compare light with light. So some of the challenges is really getting people to understand the benefits, but also being able to demonstrate those benefits relative to the more traditional way that people still look at investment.
Thank you, Dougie, that's great. And we've just had one final question come in, so I'll just ask this before I hand over to Julio. Harris asks, how do we reconcile the benefits of tourism to see wildlife versus the environmental costs to get them there?
Yeah, it's a really good question. There's no simple answer. But I think, you know, if you focus on sustainable tourism, one, you can reduce the impact of any tourism into, you know, people, the climate impact of people actually getting to the tourism sites in Scotland, coming here for a holiday, but also in terms of the kind of investment that you do and the kind of the ecotourism that you're focusing on. So if you continually try to, should we say, sell a certain image of Scotland, that might be the traditional image, and people come to Scotland and realise that it's maybe not quite as they thought, and that you know, the way we manage our land is not quite the way they thought, then there's a real danger there that you have, you know, a double negative in terms of you're going to lose some of the tourism that you wanted, and you're also not addressing the kind of the climate and biodiversity challenges within the economy. So I think it's getting those two things together, recognizing that with the right investment, it is possible to have people and nature in harmony, and that actually nature provides us with lots of benefits. And also for rural communities as well, it's going to be really important in the years ahead that they have ways of being able to maintain employment, you know, address inclusivity issues within the rural economy. So having those tourism opportunities are really vital, but making sure that we're really savvy about how people travel, how people get here, and how we invest in our natural infrastructure and make sure that we're not showing them pictures of biodiversity that is slowly dwindling and disappearing, and that we're actually showing pictures of biodiversity that's improving.
Thank you, Dougie. That's fantastic. Thank you for your very informative answers and your wonderful presentation, which concludes this webinar. So I'll now hand over to Julio for some final questions and comments.
I think we are a little pressed with time with questions, and being a Friday evening, I'm sure that everyone is going to be happy to have an early finish. So I think we've reached the end of tonight's session. Thank you, Kirsty. And of course, I would like to thank again all the speakers and the attendees who joined us for this event. I would also like to remind you that the session has been recorded and you will find it on the Trust YouTube channel if you wish to watch it again or share it with your network. Finally, if you wish to follow the work of the young leaders and to make sure you don't miss any future events, please join the Facebook group Wildlife Champions. Thank you and good night.